For this period, from the beginnings of the quest to discover, to circumnavigate the globe, to circumnavigate later Australia, this quest to control the destinies to the Americas was founded very much in the money which Spain was having, for instance, through the united crowns of Aragon and Castile by the marriage of their sovereigns, that was going to produce the money that Spain, a leading power throughout the 16th century, most of the 17th, had a position regarding reinforcement of trade that was going to deprive the British colonies of possessions, becoming a threat in the new world, in the America that was going to be in the American War of Revolution. But by such revolution, what is revolution? Is it of the people, or is it of the president, the statesman, or the monarch? Or is it of something else which can be not defined other than human nature? That resisted in 1773 the taxes which were unrepealed under the government of George III in England, which, as you know, was over the discontent sown by King George III's relentless taxation, which did not repeal the requested duties, taxes payable on tea, that culminated in the colonies irate throwing some £18,000 worth of chests of tea into the sea. We had come nowhere really, had they, from the qualms of the marriages which had failed in Henry VIII, Henry Tudor, and for instance Anne Boleyn, that caused her execution, and the execution of 1535-6 there, and Thomas More, and that later would cause the execution that to Henry VIII to execute his personal advisor, Mr. Thomas Cromwell. Spain's leading power in the 16th century was leading maritime power, reaching its apogee during the reigns of the first two Spanish Habsburgs, that is Charles I, 1516 to 56, and Philip II, who you know about, through the 1588 Armada. This period, he was born in 1556 and only lived to the youth and as much of 1598, but period which saw the Italian Wars result of the problems of Dutch revolts and other revolts, the Ottomans. The Spanish wars with France were going to be concluding that anyone who potentially involved themselves in those Spanish wars were going to be necessarily dealing with the fortunes and futures of a new world which was yet to be circumnavigated and discovered. Although in fact they claim Christopher Columbus discovered America in the late 15th century. But through exploration and royal marriage, alliances and inheritances became the norm. That created, for instance, as I say, the wars in the Spanish succession, which in fact Britain had enough problems in 1702 at home with Queen Anne and the settlement with England and Scotland, and had only just some 13, 14 years before seen the replacing the Stuart threat to the English crown with that of the Prince of Orange, as you know, in 1689, that had sent King Charles II scantering from the affair with Nell Gwyn, who was, I should mention, no mean performer, either as lover or on the stage, that you wonder really why Bonaparte, with all his height, had any chance or thought of seeing anything in revolting against any quest that Britain was to have, for instance, in its dealings with America, any more than France was ever going to be able to have the money through any marriages with Spain to achieve, certainly after the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 63, that was going to mean that the end of the Spanish decision to sit back and just accept that it had won, unfortunately, for England, Menorca. That this lady on Colin Fry's programme, she was pointing out that it had been her husband's great wish, her, to return to this bay which they had frequented in Menorca, that reminded me of the golden age, the Spanish declining golden age, that the first empire on which it is said the sun never set, this age of discovery with daring exploitations of the sea and land, bathed at the roots across the oceans and the conquest and the beginnings of European colonialism, meant that Spanish explorers were bringing back precious metals, spices and luxuries. So what makes, for instance, any navigator, for instance the Francis Drake, who was not ever much out of the favour of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth I, but what explicates a real sailor becoming more of a pirate? Well, what may explain it might be the execution of the Admiral, the captain, shall we say, of the less-than seaman who was executed in Portsmouth for having lost the island of Minorca, where the British had had to retreat to Gibraltar. And indeed, in the 16th, 17th century, Spain becoming confronted by unrelenting challenges from all sides, Barbary pirates under this aegis of the rapidity of growing Ottoman Empire, disrupting lives in many coastal areas through their slave raids, and the renewed threat of Islamic invasion. Has it ever gone away, the threat of what is called IS? IS. In many ways, you wonder if it is just a figment of the imagination. That, for instance, a Spain which once was going to be, in the Middle Ages, the expelling Jews from its country because they refused to take the Christian baptismal rites. How much more unjust is, for instance, a Nazi for wanting to right the problems which even Britain could not counter in any way, much, even really, in truth, through the marriage of Mary I and Philip II of Spain, that in the middle 1500s was going to counter this revolting whereby Christians would try to rule the world and the Tudor dynasty would try to outlaw the Italian and the Catholic and create its own church. That you wonder, don't you, what is so pure about a Puritan or a Church of England? Or what is adjusted in simple terms, that waters down so much as £18,000 worth of tea because the taxes weren't just or weren't wished to be paid for it by the American colonists. So that effectively, after the battles that waged through the world, affected the world in the 7 Years' War of the 1756 to 63, and as far as the piano was concerned, had in fact seen Burkhard Schudi come to England as a carpenter from those Swiss Austrian climes to work for the firm of John Broadwood and Sons, that would become one of the greater exponents in pianoforte manufacture. That liberalism and the nation state surely bore some responsibility to the fact that by the qualms that France was going to have through having to cede again to Great Britain the island of Minorca was going to be on the Mr. Fry programme some effect in that mediumship being ineffective, not only in the fact that she was not going to be seeing the bay in Minorca, which was frequented by her now late husband, but which you wonder what posterity truly lay in the fact that by 1793, Spain going to war against the revolutionary new French Republic as a member of the First Coalition could ever write any more to the weakness that England would be showing by doing absolutely nothing, whose tea was being transported to America's Boston and had £18,000 worth of chest tea thrown into the sea, that the effects by 1800 were well spent and forgotten, to the extent that Napoleon's threat was the culminating factor in British policy by then. But up until that time, people were blaming who was very much in some circles defined as an idiot, the Pitt William Pitt the Younger. His prime ministership was going to be under threat for not being enforceable in its taxes placed in the American colonization and reconstitution. That in fact this allowed slavery in the southern states to be proceeded for another 80 years until then in the American Civil War the slavery of the southern states would be effectively ended, but that was not going to be without some bloodshed and had no clean bill of health to any necessary sanity that explains why or how it protected slaves other than disenfranchising them sometimes from the support of their masters. So you may ask yourselves, what were the effects in England in 1773 of the Boston Tea Party? The effects were immeasurably quelled by the fact that the turbulence through England having not any allies to constitute any oppressive resistance towards the American regime meant that it turned its sights upon France and effectively sought to accumulate, if not an ally, the requisite necessity to annihilate any degrees by which it could be regarded as an enemy, and certainly that which provided its money to the country which was Spain, who actually achieved by the American War of Revolution the control of Florida, while the British were allowed to maintain control of Canada. And so it is that this Georgian third of Britain was in fact no more advanced politically in terms of world enterprise than it had been even by such fireworks music under the guise of the music of Frederick Handel had been under George II, and in fact the idea that the future Georges were going to be under some European connection. But since the affairs leading up to 1789, having seen the 7 Years' War, degradation suffered by France and its rather effects of some through impecuniosity in the resulting of speculation and waste, which had left France depriving of some in that of the Emperor Louis XVI, that by the 21st of January 1793 was going to lead to his execution in the Place de la Revolution in Paris, had meant that England's only triumph, perhaps, entering towards the year 1800, was going to be in the memory, for instance, of the celebration that had been for the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, and that music for the Royal Fireworks, which was under the contract of George II of Great Britain, in London's Green Park on the 27th of April 1749, of celebrating the end of the War of Austrian Succession and the signing of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, otherwise the name of Aachen, A-A-C-H-E-N, in 1748. But you ask yourself, how much does one George II want to cover up more than the other of what is really English music, or under the pen and quill, or will and pen of William Pitt, or the dastardly effects of more than a Frenchman could equate to the music of some part of Saxony or future desolate of the effects of the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire, which was eventually, wasn't it, going to end in the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914, and going to lead to the Great War to end all wars, and the rise of the Nazi Party, which was only the second in the persecution of the Jewish people since Spain, wasn't it really? And who was the greater in Christianity, the persecutor, whether it be Henry VIII in the persecution of the Italian Church, or in Sir Winston Churchill's persecution of the Italian Navy with the destruction of the Italian fleet at Taranto, can only explain the folly and the madness that is equated in music and the way you play it, viewer, than I even set foot or know how to on board some boat that they have to rename long after battleships were ever found to be so obsolete as after the Tirpitz of 1944 was sunk by the tool boy. And I have been to Mr. Barneswaller's house, and I have seen the madness which emanates from the game of marbles as much in a garden. Or is it that you persist in inventing tunes as popular music because you propose a myth that your country could ever be greater, for instance, than a German, in music, or that a country as wide as England could ever succeed in rising above the great Stuart kingdom, whose ethics were not short, were they, of supplying Nell Gwyn with either the money to perform, which is more than you can say for some artists, present names exempted, or were they going to be as such assuaged of people such as the forerunners of World War I, which were going to be, for instance, embodied in pomp and circumstance, was it, of Sir Edward Elgar, that had been triumphed under some by a queen who was expectant in that her country would eventually love her again after the husband's death of Prince Albert in 1861? Or were these the works of folly that were leading to the madness of such composers as People Max or Davis would cherish or masterfully admire such compositions of Mr. John Lennon, totally by the swinging 60s, that you would know, look at all the people, was it truly more great than the music for the Royal Fireworks, composed by Frederick Handel under George II? Look at all the people, and then you pay millions and thousands for the music, and almost as much for the old piano, what we call in the trade viewer a bone shaker, than can even measure the greatness of it, and produced by the empire of the sun, as much as the one you tried to annihilate some of those presidents or monarchs who call themselves men of honor in that aftermath of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, that really does not bear any execution of further sanity than after George IV, ending in such parliamentary disarray that Earl Grey's ministry as Prime Minister was effectively so ineffectual because government and Parliament had been reformed in the 1832 Reform Act. I mean, you accuse her of not bidding on her piano, of not being that great, of being overcomplicated, or being too simplified, or what does the entity of the beginner make of it all? I would humble myself as much as run as far away as James II ever intended, or Charles II ever became imprisoned by, the furthest wall of the state of China, than to measure anything of Georgian England and the Boston Tea Party.
I am justice, a fool, am I, the kind, where love begins.
music for the royal fireworks by a German, future, past or present, as anything truly greater than what I write. So it is that the enfranchised Napoleon Bonaparte, and through the loss in fact of Minorca, which had been in 1756, meant that Britain was at some loss, not only to find allies in the world, but at some loss to defend itself against really any enemy. And that included not only America, which it had lost in terms of, except by ending such war by 1783, that it had not gained the annihilation of its enemy, which was newly forming in that of France by the emergence of the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, and all those things which it had gained by the wars of Austrian succession, and the fact that Spain had to some extent become a certain amount weaker at the beginning of the 1700s in the Spanish succession crisis, but never achieved the resolution by English standards and achieving the statesmanlike ability to gain reputation amongst its own people in England, with George III entering into a state of mental melancholy and problems physically, which being taken under the wing later of Prince Regent, who would later become king, was largely culminated and accumulated and managed by the Queen Consort of George III up until his death in 1820. So it is I introduce to you my piano that you have heard and you will hear. What difference does it make if the glorious revolution of 1689 or the short-lived inglorious revolution of 1868 and the short-lived First Spanish Republic can have any more stable monarchic period characterized by any practice of turismo, rotation of government, progressive or conservative, within Spanish government, under any Salic law, or any misdemeanor other than the fact that if your name is Victoria and your husband is dead, you have become, in some way, the impertinent to the Salic law, or the royal law of succession that promotes, for instance, the more treasured male as being so much more esteemed in successive rule of monarch than the humble female. That we have in my song, Kelsey, the equation of a conversation which was spent in some time at the table where it was in one of the French previously esteemed English villages, and now frequented by young lady who would effectively overhear a conversation which very much she has invented for your very ears. The piece, isn't it, that justifies so many sailors having been lost by 5,000 ships in the Battle of Trafalgar. No, not one ship was lost, but 5,000 sailors. Says something about Spain losing, not Britain losing. that had already lost. Spain had lost. That the future of the Western Sahara, Spanish Morocco and Equatorial Guinea were shaped by World War II, but never solved.
Thank you.